Well, good afternoon, everyone. No, I'm not going to be one of those who is more optimistic. I'm afraid not. I think the return to anywhere near the level of employment of 2007, 2008 is years away in the Eurozone and elsewhere, and I'll tell you why. I think I enjoyed Dean's talk very much indeed, and I'm taking away a lot of things about it. I even have questions for later on for him, but my theme today was to talk a little bit about labor market institutions. And if this were like Economics 101 at the undergraduate level, then I'd ask each of you to take out a piece of paper and define labor market institutions. And then I'd ask you to define what they're good for. Right? And I think we'd come away with a rich harvest of very diverse responses to this. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that. I'd like to talk also a tiny bit personally, since I am with the International Labor Organization, the UN agency, and things like that, and tell you why I think we got it wrong for many years in the ILO, defending things that were probably not defensible, but we were under attack by other agencies that found that any labor law was a nefarious sort of thing that had to be gotten rid of. And so we went through that kind of quarter century of a debate on labor market flexibility that I think is ending. But I do have to say also that I think ILO's defense of labor market institutions and labor market regulation were quite well founded to the extent that labor has taken a huge hit in our economies. As Dean said, the labor share of national income has declined. Not just in the U.S., I'm afraid, just about everywhere. Right? And that's a huge problem macroeconomically because, as you know, consumption is the major component of aggregate demand. Right? And if there's no income, then people don't consume. And so that prolongs what we call recessions. Right? And so that I think probably was a bit about how we looked at the labor scene. And we talk about labor market institutions also at the ILO for defining not merely the wage share in national income, but what's happened to contracts. And contracts at work in our advanced economies have utterly fragmented into all sorts of various precarious forms where people do not have employment security. Right? Collective bargaining no longer works in many countries of the world. It may not be because the law says we're now against freedom of association. It's merely a balance of power question. And so collective bargaining is no longer a solution in many contexts. Look at Greece, right? And you'll see the complete dismantling of what was then a collective bargaining system with national tripartite decision-making gone. Right? So what I'm saying is that the labor market and its institutions are taking a real big hit in the crisis since the fall of Lehman Brothers and in its aftermath. And this is something that I think we have to be worried about. In particular, I'm worried about the rise of precariousness and inequality. I'm saying this because a lot of my recent work has been in the area of behavioral economics. I'm quite interested in behavioral economics. And there, what we're seeing is that we're finding that insecurity, right, and precariousness are huge factors on self-reported well-being of people. It diminishes their self-reported well-being in an enormous way, bigger than many, many other factors that can happen on the labor market. It's dysfunctional socially, and therefore it's dysfunctional economically. So, I mean, I think that one thing that I can say is that when we look at the world from this perspective of behavioral economics, we're not talking about you and me as individuals. We're talking about us relatively. How relatively are we doing? Right? And the answer is not great. There's something that many of you might have heard of called the Easterlin paradox, right, of Richard Easterlin's fame of now 40 years ago almost, where we discovered that a fourfold real income increase in the United States does not produce people saying that they are more content. So what we're on is this sort of hedonic treadmill that makes people compare themselves to others and often compare themselves unfavorably. I think that has everything to do with the Arab Spring that we heard about a couple of years ago. It has everything to do, I think, with what is going on in the world today. We compare ourselves relative to other people, and if we're not doing as well as they are, we are discontented. And that discontent has many manifestations. They're physiological, they're psychological. Suicide rates among the unemployed, for example, are extremely high relative to a broader sample of the population. And I think that these things are not going to be put away quite quickly in our world today. So here again, I agree with Dean that we've got a long road to hoe before we get out of this mess. So, I mean, my first point is that labor market institutions endeavor to mitigate the consequences of inequality, the consequences of purely market-driven outcomes in the labor market. If you look at Belgium and the United States, you'll discover that the level of inequality from purely primary market-driven sources is identical. Right? But you'll discover that the tax and transfer system in Belgium reduces the Gini coefficient, the measurement of inequality, by at least 50% more than it does in the United States. And I consider, therefore, that this is a labor market institution worthy of some discussion. Now, having said that, I think, again, from an Economics 101 perspective, we need a very broad view of what labor market institutions are all about. The Indians, for example, refer to not the informal and the formal economies, but the organized and unorganized economies. I've always objected to this. There's no such thing as an unorganized economy. No such thing. Informal economies are always organized in one way or the other, usually suboptimally, usually with low productivity, usually with all the kind of downsides that we see in terms of access to public services, but they're organized. So it's a question of organizing ourselves as a social body in the labor market that is at stake here, and I think this is extremely important. So labor market institutions channel incentives toward good ends. They disallow behaviors that are bad. They provide fundamental social protection, and they improve, when they're well designed, the functioning of the labor market by improving labor market mobility. That's my Economics 101 answer to that question. Right? They improve labor market mobility when they're well designed by providing protection to people who change from jobs to jobs. Okay. Now, having said that, then that's my first point. I've got only two other points. Gosh, it's late in the day. It's the end of the conference, and I'm not going to go on and on. I haven't said much about the economics of the matter, and the economics of the matter are remarkably important, and we don't know as much about them as we'd like to know. We simply don't. If you want to write a thesis on the economics of labor market institutions, right, it might be a slim volume, right, because we still have much more work to do. But let me take a page from Germany. I'm sure that Dr. Müller is going to tell us much more about this. All right? But it's from the crisis, where we saw a labor market institution called Kurzarbeit work effectively well in Germany in preserving over 1 million jobs. Right? It's a simple concept when you think about it. Yeah? Okay, the companies are in trouble. Okay, we relieve you from some of your labor costs. You lay off people. No. It's cheaper for the unemployment insurance system to partially lay off these people. And the people retain a tie to the labor market. A brilliant concept. Why isn't it widespread? Why didn't it happen in France or Italy or Greece or elsewhere? Right? So it's this, I would argue, is a fantastic labor market institution that happened, didn't happen in the crisis. It kicked in the crisis as an automatic stabilizer in the German system. And this was like utterly vital for Germany's recovery. Germany, as you recall, is the only place in this lousy economic period where unemployment actually declined. Yeah, holy cow! I'm from America, never saw that. Yeah? And it was a remarkable institution to do this. Why? Well, because our research shows at the ILO that product markets will recover, capital markets will recover, and yes, this has been a brutal financial recession, but they'll recover. These two markets will recover more rapidly than the labor market. Labor markets, traditionally, since the 1960s, in the face of a financial recession, have taken a minimum of 5 or 6 years to recover to their pre-recession status. We've had the Great Recession, and then we had the Eurozone crisis, which means that labor markets in Europe are not going to recover anytime soon. That's my bad news. I just don't think it's going to happen. Skills erode, hopes diminish, people leave the labor market, they never got back into it. I think, again, not just because I'm sitting here in Germany, but I think the Kurzarbeit approach to this was one of the most effective labor market institutions that I've seen in practice. Who tried to emulate it? Well, South Africa. South Africa fell on its face. South Africa has, for over 40 million people. They tried to introduce a sort of Kurzarbeit idea, and it was able to reach about 5,000 people in the labor market. Not a big dent. Not a big dent in that country. And I think the major reason is because they tried something new in the midst of a crisis, whereas Germany already had it in place. So that's another message to impart. I mean, for the economic benefits of labor market institutions to kick in, it's good to have them in place to begin with, rather than after the fact. When you look at, for example, the United States, decimation in the Great Depression of the 1930s, what do? We created unemployment insurance. If you look at Japan, decimation after World War II, what did they do? They created unemployment insurance. When you look at Thailand, where I was posted for 4 years, after the Asian financial crisis, what did they do? Unemployment insurance. Having some sort of social protection floor as a fundamental labor market institution adds to stability and automatic stabilization that is hard to invent in the midst of the event. So that's one of the strong economic points. Okay, now I think I'd like to say that there are things lurking behind the unemployment rate, that we should doubt. And I'll talk about my own country just as Dean did. Same country. It's a big place. For much of my life, the concept of long-term unemployment was utterly foreign to America. Unemployment was not foreign to America, but you quickly turned around and got another job. Right? What this recession showed is that long-term unemployment peaked to about 40% of total unemployment. From an American perspective, those are European numbers. We haven't seen long-term unemployment like that ever. And that is one thing behind the difficulty of getting out of this trap, of reducing unemployment and creating jobs, even with the glimmers of recovery in our economies. It's going to take a long time for that, and even in the United States. Right? Now, the other thing is, unemployment rates hide a great deal of stuff. I'm from the ILO, therefore we use ILO international definitions on what employment and unemployment means. If you go to sub-Saharan Africa and you ask a person, have you been employed for 1 hour in the last week? And that person says yes, then stamp, you're employed. What's the person going to say? I'm unemployed, I'm without work, obviously. Right? So definitions hide a great deal. If you look at my own country, where the unemployment rate actually means something, as it means here in Germany, you know what an unemployed person is, but then you add in discouraged workers, and you add in involuntary part-time workers, then the American unemployment rate is double what you read in the newspapers today. Right? So the point I'm making is that the labor market is suffering a great deal, and I don't see any really quick way out of it. Right? The third problem I'd like to raise here is that the Great Recession hit us with a big one, right? And a lot of people lost jobs. What happens in a big recession? Well, we assume it's cyclical and things will get better. Right? But this has not happened. This has not happened. Instead, what we're looking at is a phenomenon that we call structural unemployment. In other words, the longer that you are outside of the labor market, the more difficult it is to return to whatever job you might have had or get a new one of equivalent qualifications. If you're an employer sitting out there, and I come to you and say, well, you know, I've kind of been unemployed for 12 months, you're going to hire me? Probably not. So the economics behind this is called the Beveridge curve. We take a look at the relationship between published vacancies and the unemployment rate. All right, published vacancies and the unemployment rate, and it goes like that. Right? The more vacancies, the lower the level of unemployment. Right? Now, what happens in a recession of this magnitude is that whole curve shifts right. In other words, we have vacancies. We have vacancies, but we still have a high degree of unemployed people, which means that the phenomenon has become structural. Okay? When that happens, macro tools don't work. We talked about this for the past couple of days. There's been papers on internal devaluation in the Eurozone and things like that for countries that can't control their own exchange rate. Fine. But what I'm saying is that we can't control our own exchange rate, we can't control monetary policy, we can't control fiscal policy to make the unemployment disappear if that problem has become structural. Right? And I think in many contexts it has. So I'm really bleak, you know, and I apologize for this. I mean, it's the end of the conference, and I should be saying cheery things. But I have one third and final point to make. Which is a bit cheerier. Again, I don't want to be too like internal navel gazing and things like that, but what we've seen in the multilateral system, of which I'm a member, is a much closer meeting of the minds than we've had in a quarter of a century, and I think it's really good. I'll mention the OECD Job Study of 1994. There were something like 26 recommendations of the OECD Job Study of 1994. 2 of them had to do with macroeconomic policy, right? And the remaining 23 or 24 had everything to do with how labor markets were lousy, and they had to be deregulated. Right? OECD revisited that study just a couple of years ago, changed its mind, said labor market institutions actually matter. They matter for equity. Equity matters for growth, etc. Right? Our wavelength at the ILO, exactly. Last year, we had the publication of the World Bank's World Development Report on jobs. You know? And all of a sudden, the ice melted on the labor market flexibility, labor market rigidity debate that we've been having for a quarter century. Because the World Bank did a couple of things in that study. First, it asserted it didn't stand economics on its head. You know? It did say, oh, growth matters for job creation. ILO would thoroughly agree with that. Growth matters for job creation. But then it said, job creation matters for growth. In other words, a good job, a job with developmental prospects, actually matters for development and growth. And we said, whoa, yeah, we're on the same page, singing the same tune. And that was very good news. The second thing they said, and I'll stop with the World Bank here, is that there is a plateau of labor market regulation. A plateau of labor market regulation. If you fall off it on one end, then your economy is under-regulated. This is the World Bank talking, you know? Not the ILO. We'd have said that for years. Right? Fall off it on one end, then you're under-regulated, and under-regulation has its own economic penalties to, that are induced. It's not merely a question of social protection, which we would emphasize certainly from where I work, but it's also a question of economic penalty of under-regulation. How are people going to have, look at the information asymmetries in the labor market. How are people going to find work and things like that, and get training, and et cetera? That's bad. And then, of course, if you fall off the plateau on the other end, okay, here we're talking rigidity. You know, we're talking labor market regulations that are inappropriate, too restrictive, they don't allow micro-flexibility, they therefore curb employment creation, and they do a whole bunch of damage economically as well as for the person who cannot find a job. I think we agree with that too. It's that big plateau in the middle that is the novelty here. The big plateau in the middle is where labor market regulation is different from country to country, but appropriate. And if it's appropriate, then it doesn't really affect economic or employment performance. And that's a very important message. It doesn't really affect economic or employment performance. It affects all those former variables I talked about. Things like happiness, things like social protection, things like rules and fairness and all this sort of thing, but it doesn't affect economic and employment performance. So there's the OECD, there's the World Bank, already, I think, from our perspective, coming to agree on a sort of consensus view of what labor market regulation is all about. Now, to conclude, Chair, if I may, I'll throw in another organization that we've always loved at the ILO. It's called the International Monetary Fund, IMF. And actually, the love affair is indeed increasing. We're on the same wavelength with people at the IMF these days. I mean, the chief economist, Olivier Blanchard, has just published a paper called Moving Beyond Mantras. And the mantras that he's referring to are the same ones that I have been referring to. What we always thought dogmatically about how labor markets work and how institutions work in the labor market is wrong. So what is the IMF talking about? They're talking about the fact that in our societies, in advanced countries, there's been a dualism of labor market outcomes. If you're on a temporary contract in Spain, then you're the guy who lost his or her job. Temporary versus full-time contracts, that kind of dualism has been damaging in terms of the fairness or the sharing of the outcomes of the Great Recession. Now, how does that happen? Labor market regulation. What's the IMF recipe? There shouldn't be that dualism. Do they have the right recipe for ending that dualism? No. But you know, they're looking for one. They're looking for one. And I think that's something that we would agree with wholeheartedly. IMF says that the long-term unemployed have been completely forgotten in the recovery. That's what I just said, based on our own work on structural unemployment. Right? These people will never get back to work, many of them. I think that, that too is a good message. We need micro-flexibility, the IMF is saying, to bring workers to higher productivity jobs. Nobody is against that. The major source of productivity increase is intersectoral mobility, even though there's a lot of intra-sectoral mobility, productivity increase as well. But moving from sector to sector is the source of productivity increase. We know this since Arthur Lewis, if not before. Right? IMF is saying this. We've said this. IMF is also saying, but we need to protect that mobility. We don't want to protect jobs. We want to protect people. So IMF is saying that we need a social floor. And that's exactly, by the way, what the ILO is saying as well. We don't need to protect jobs. We need to protect the mobility of workers to find good and decent jobs. Okay, so with those few remarks, I just wanted to say that I began on a bleak note, and I kind of have to retain that bleakness a little bit in terms of labor market outcomes in the short term. But what I am saying, and I suppose we should all be happy about that, all of us international taxpayers, that the multilateral system is beginning to speak with one voice on what labor market regulation is all about, and its good points and its bad points. Thanks.